and welcome back to another episode of the Unfounded podcast, everyone. My name is Christopher Turner, and I am your host. Thank you for joining me whenever you are joining me, whether it's on the podcast on one of the hosting platforms on your phone, or whether you're joining me live right now on YouTube or on Facebook. Thank you very much for tuning in. So, first off today, I have some things I want to talk about, obviously. It's an odd subject that I want to talk about today. Sorry for the delay there. Trying to get settled here before we get rolling into it. First off, I do have in my description of the episode notes, there's links to my Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, show homepage, and my Patreon page. If you enjoyed the show, if you think it's valuable, or if you want to support in any way, please follow those links. Check out my Facebook page. That's where I'm most active, and I'm trying to be a little more active on Instagram. I'm going to be developing my own content there. Things centered around the quotes that we use and try to pull apart in the podcast. And so they're going to be some kind of like cool motivational style posts that I'll be putting on Instagram here shortly. But with all that out of the way, again, sorry for the technical issues I've had recently. I've been figuring out this streaming thing, and so the streams that went up on YouTube before I had some settings wrong, so they didn't properly upload. And the Facebook stream last week didn't have any music in it. It should have it now. But sorry for the technical difficulties there as well. And also, apologies for the delay. I have been very busy getting my life in order here, guys, and it's been a rough one for me, right? We've gone over that, and I don't want to kind of stick on myself for too long today because I think I've been doing a lot of that. Instead, I want to try to get back on track with this podcast. Try to think about some of those unfounded ideas, some of the really deeply held ideas that we don't ever really question. One of those, and it's not really an idea, but I want to talk about talking to yourself today, oddly enough. Because I find that the more I've been isolated, the more I've gone through this kind of spiritual journey and awakening of sorts, the more I've realized that there's this internal dialogue that has started, or I've been cultivating. And the best way to describe it is talking to yourself, right? Look at what I'm doing right now. Effectively, I am talking to myself, right? This is what I'm talking about, is this kind of dialogue. There's a negative connotation to it. And I want to try to figure out why there's a negative connotation to this type of introspective thought. It's odd. I want to read you a couple quotes here to start off with. A couple different perspectives that I think will be helpful in pulling apart this idea. The first quote is by let me read his full name, D. Martin Lloyd Jones. And it goes, "Have you realized that most of your unhappiness in life is due to the fact that you are listening to yourself instead of talking to yourself? Take those thoughts," let me show you what I'm looking at here. "Take those thoughts," oh, that's the wrong one, "that come to you the moment you wake up in the morning. You have not originated them, but they are talking to you. They bring back the problems of yesterday, etc. Somebody is talking. Who is talking to you? Yourself is talking to you. Now, this man's treatment was this," and this is a psalm that he's reading from. "Instead of allowing this self to talk to him, he starts talking to himself. 'Why art thou cast down, O my soul?' he asks. His soul had been depressing him, crushing him. So he stands up and says, 'Self, listen for a moment. I will speak to you.'" What Martin Lloyd is talking about here is this internal dialogue, is talking to yourself. That there's some aspect of the self, the soul, that when unchallenged wreaks havoc. I guess is kind of what he's getting at. This is a complex idea. That the human being really isn't all good deep down, maybe. That there's something to contend with there. That you can see throughout humanity's existence, the proclivity for the human being to act impulsively, to act aggressively, to act on negative emotion, to infringe others' rights, to try to seize power, try to consolidate power, try to compartmentalize the world. Excuse me, my dog's having a little bit of one of those reverse sneezes going. You good, babe? You got it. Get it out. My goodness. Well, that was a long one. That's like the longest one she's ever had. Sorry for the interruption there, guys. That there's this aspect within the human being that is not well put together. That what the human being deep down is, as a soul, as an eternal thing, is something imperfect. And we've gone over this before too. Something flawed. And there's something in the process of embodying a soul, literally placing that kind of, by definition, unlimited, timeless thing within a finite space. By restraining it, creates the conditions through which consciousness arises in some way, through which we view ourselves. And part of the way that you vet yourself, that you view yourself, is through this internal dialogue of sorts. Like at a very fundamental level, through recognizing that there is this process exists. That there's something to talk to, right? Why don't people like to talk to themselves? Well, it's an easy question to answer because you can ask it to yourself. You can kind of analyze yourself with it whenever you're in a situation where maybe you are talking to yourself and somebody sees you doing it. You get this immediate sense of insecurity, right? Being very uncomfortable. You kind of want to hide it. Oh, I can't let them see. Because this happens to me all the time because I talk to myself a lot, if you couldn't tell. So people try to hide it. And there's this shame that I see in myself and in others when approaching the process of talking to yourself. And I think maybe at a deep level, this could be part of it, is that if you are wrapped in the ego game, as we've laid out before, if you believe that all that exists is your conception of yourself, that there's nothing deeper guiding you, if you believe that everything is somewhat external to you, that there's this linear way in which the world unfolds, and that the way in which you navigate the world is something like observing it and reacting, right? That this logical and linear way of viewing the world doesn't allow space for another dialogue in some way. That internal dialogue requires internal vision, right? It requires you to look internally and recognize at a fundamental level that there is something there to talk to. And that it's odd that we've made that socially this has become a taboo thing, because it's an indicator of the depth of our denial as a thing. How deeply lost we are. How disconnected we are from the process through which all of this has happened. I got into it a little bit, I think it was a couple episodes ago, but talking about genius. How does genius come to fruition? What is it? I think it was last episode, actually. The Akashic Record, being able to tap into the idea of this general knowledge base. That from what I can gather, that genius really is something like unfettered self-expression. It's like the properly identified self expressed fully. That's what true genius is. The reason it's genius is because it's actually coming from somewhere else. That the individuals themselves aren't making ideas. What the individual itself is doing is something like aligning at an energetic level. It's a process we haven't been able to describe through science, I don't think, very well, but nevertheless, it's a process that exists, I think, that there's some kind of alignment that's necessary. That how you align properly is through a dialogue of sorts, an internal dialogue. Something that Martin Lloyd-Jones outlines at the very end of this. The first moment through which the awakening happens, in which a person decides, I'm talking now. Something like that. Instead of allowing this self to talk to him, he starts talking to himself. Why art thou cast down, O my soul? He asks. His soul had been depressing him, crushing him. So he stands up and says, Self, listen for a moment. I will speak to you. His soul had been depressing him, crushing him. What does it feel like when you feel lost? What is the characteristics of a lost individual? The mode of being they embody. Something like depression. Something like weight. Right? I believe what Martin Lloyd-Jones here is identifying is that the weight that we often feel, that we often carry around in the world, is the denial of ourselves. That nobody likes to be ignored, including you. Who you are deeply. The longer you deny this internal dialogue, this internal conversation, the more left out in the cold your deep self feels, your eternal self, your soul, the thing with a mission. The further away you get from that, the less dialogue you have internally, the more you take in external factors, external stimulus to fill in your logical map of the world, the less that internal dialogue seems to be of practical importance. And so oftentimes we'll cease looking internally at all. Oftentimes after we get into the real world, right? We'll shut off the dialogue entirely. And we produce a sort of mimicry, a herd mentality. It's maybe where the herd mentality gets turned on. It's in like the final death of the child within. That if you had to conceptualize what your eternal self is, it's like the child version of you. It's like the unadulterated version of you. And that what we do as adults, and what this modern world tells us to do, is to kill off the idea of the child inside. The idea of the child is also attached to dreams, hopes, joy, passion, love, beauty. That the logical mind is very good at specific things, but it's not good at those things. It's not good at love and beauty, harmony, balance. The logical mind is a form of scheme. It's a scheming mode of being. One that's very hard to embody permanently without becoming an ego monster. The reason is not something does not speak ill of any person that actually embodies that mode of being. It's actually a process of corruption that happens slowly over time, I believe. The longer you look externally, the more disconnected from your own internal voice you'll become. The more lost, the more heavy, the more depressed you'll feel. The more you'll look externally for things to fill in that void. Oftentimes, we get And I notice this modern day as well, that there's this stubbornness that happens in that mode of being as well. And I think it's a deeply rooted fear. It's something like wanting control. That when you're in the logical space, what you're trying to do is control the car, right? Trying to perceive what's coming, what's come before, what's going to come, and to try to plot courses through that produces efficiency, safety, right? Predictability, those kind of things. But what often gets lost in that mindset is the enjoyment aspect, the love, the beauty, the harmony. So that as we grow up, everything that's associated with the child dies off, because we're told that what you need to do is grow up. As if the mode of being that the child embodies isn't sufficient. Very odd game we play. It's not sufficient in the systems we've created. Thus, there's a necessity to eliminate it within the individual. This process is insidious, and I believe has culminated in something like a political and social movement to eliminate the individual entirely. I'm going to move on to another quote. This one's by Jim Carey. He's a fairly eccentric figure. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Jim Carrey's work. But there's a couple documentaries that are very interesting to watch on him. This is one of them. It's Jim and Andy, The Great Beyond. I don't know if any of you ever watched, I think it's Man on the Moon. It is a movie about Andy Kaufman's life, who was a comedian, very eccentric individual. And Jim Carrey, he played the role of Andy Kaufman, but he used the method acting mode to play the role. And if you watch this documentary, what you'll see is Jim get lost in the process of identity creation. It's something like demonstrating, showing to you that the ego isn't real, or that identity itself in some way is very deeply rooted, so that you can attempt to layer something on top of it, to mask it with something, to create something that in your mind is a better version, but that it's never sufficient. And that it causes inside of the individual something like fractures. That the longer that process goes on, that hiding goes on, the deeper the fissures become, the less stable the individual is, the more prone to kind of mental breaks. Jim and Andy, The Great Beyond. Give it a watch. But this is a quote from that movie. At some point, when you create yourself to make it, you're going to have to either let that creation go and take a chance on being loved or hated for who you really are, or you're going to have to kill who you really are and fall into your grave grasping a character you never were. Talking to yourself isn't a trivial matter. We like to make fun of people we see on the street corner sitting there mumbling, right? People point and laugh. Look at that individual talking to themselves. How crazy must they be? You're not. And that might be more crazy. There's something so dangerous in straying away from who you are at a deep level. This isn't just like this idea isn't trivial, like I just said. It's not like a funny haha. It's like there's a necessity, a deep necessity to you talking to yourself every day, constantly. And that the more you cultivate that conversation, the more a separation is created internally, where you actually start to conceptualize the perspective of you as separate from the eternal thing that is you, right? That there's two different ways in which you can view you. There's the eternal deep thing, and there's the physical kind of motor-based thing. And that there's a necessity for both of those two ideas of the individual to function in harmony. And what facilitates that kind of harmony is something like a dialogue between those two. It's a form of communication between those, in some ways, two identities. It's like the human being really is in a way, it's not an identity, but it's just based on the fact that we view the world from a singular point of view, from a singular space in time, creates this idea of the perception itself having cognition. But that what I'm wondering is if the cognition is something is not just the vision. It's not sufficient. It's there's not enough depth to just seeing something. It's like a camera doesn't have emotion. A camera doesn't express itself. A camera doesn't decide that it wants to be, a speaker tomorrow, right? But it can still view everything. It can still take in audio information. It can still see everything that's going on. It's like the embodying of the eternal soul is what creates perspective, and it grows out of that. And that the proper way to go through life is something like allowing the eternal thing to kind of connect in a way to the physical thing and to the spiritual realm. It's something like the soul connects us between what is seen, what is physical, like this plane of existence, and the plane of existence that exists at a deeper level. Another dimension of some sort. And that's what the Akashic record is, right? It exists in that other realm. So that the only way, literally, the only way you access that kind of information is going through you. You have to channel it through you. And this translation, going back and forth, of information coming from kind of the eternal realm, translated into the physical realm. And then the individual, the soul, at the middle of that, taking the individual from the information from the physical realm and translating it back out. This back and forth, right? That's the proper function of the human being. The biggest leaps we've seen as a society, as a collective, has been when individuals have not perfected, but figured out a way to maintain that connection, because it requires an incredible demand on the individual. It's why in most religions, in all of religions, there is something like sacrifice. The idea of sacrifice appears within the religion itself. It's because in order for you to embody the proper mode of being, and there is a proper mode of being, and that's one of the other issues we have modern day, but I digress, that proper mode of being is something like connecting the two realms, right? Being the thing that is connected to both, aligning those worlds. And that the process in which you do that is literally through speech, through action, through movement, through energetic consumption. That you sacrifice energy. You expend energy to translate this message into a physical space. And that's how it is created, fundamentally. It's through injection of energy by you. And that the reverse side of that it doesn't just go one way. It's not like you just take your dreams and your ideas from the eternal realm, speak them into being, and then there they are. It's something like the process has to go the other way as well. It's a very intricate thing that's going on here. Everything is very intricate. And so that the only way that the ideal form of reality comes into being is through radical honesty within the individual. It's something like a game of telephone, right? You imagine that individual, imagine the soul, right? What you are deeply eternally. Imagine that as like a chain. And between that chain, you have this one world that is eternal and this one world that is physical and finite. And that you are the line that connects those two things. And that in order for that connection to function properly, you have to be able to deliver the message unadulterated. How that message becomes unadulterated is something like the individual not recognizing what it is. Something like ego building, something like the process of defining yourself as something that you aren't, because it pulls you out of the frame of mind, out of the perspective in which you could recognize the necessity for internal dialogue, something like that, right? So you stop the process entirely and you go out into the world operating on something like a logic-based mode of being. That actors, as Jim Carey was just kind of talking about here in this quote, that actors themselves oftentimes they're complicated individuals. And you see a lot of times you'd expect, these people at the top of our society to be incredibly happy, right? Overcome with joy for their position in society. But often what you'll see is a lot of drug use, a lot of depression. You'll see a lot of self-development, kind of like you've seen Jim Carey go through. Child stars, this is even more prevalent. There's something very difficult about being in the spotlight, about being in that position. Deeper yet, there's something very difficult about being an actor. I think the reason that it's difficult, and I'm not sitting here saying like actors need our help. I'm just saying that there is something meaningful in the idea of what they do. It's like actors really do play with the idea of identity. That's what they do. And method acting specifically is the process of allowing yourself to really get lost in that ego game. Something like that. It's like in having the intention of creating the ego. Setting out from the beginning to create something that is not you. And there's something about that process, putting on that mask that was intentionally created to represent something other than you, that makes you recognize how deeply and utterly depressing and horrifying that is. That one of the best ways to see that is to do it on purpose. Is to actually try to hide yourself. At some point when you create yourself to make it, when you look externally, you take that stimulus in and you just create something based off of nothing but the external world and not the eternal you, you're going to have to either let that creation go and take a chance on being loved or hated for who you really are, because you're not going to be able to wear the facade forever. The mask will continue to become heavier. It's a burden you're adding on top of the real you, something that will keep you from expressing fully who you are. And the type of pain that creates inside of an individual is something that is very dangerous. Something that we haven't properly identified as such. It's why you see, I think, so many mental health issues within the acting community. Because this process is dangerous. Allowing your ego to run rampant is dangerous. The only way that that problem gets solved, the only way that we get control of this ego madness that is going on around the world is for each individual person to start that kind of dialogue, which is why it's such a difficult problem to solve. Because you can't motivate people in some kind of group think. You can't go out there and tell them that the world is this segmented thing that has good and bad. That there's specific reasons and scapegoats that you can point to allow people to feel some kind of justification for the way in which they go about their lives. The moral and an ethical mode in which they allow themselves to be each and every day. There's a justification that people have, and it's something like everybody else is doing it too. We're all extremely good actors. I often think that's probably why we enjoy acting so much. Is because it really is like the ultimate truth. It's like a point, it's one of the reasons why I miss the movie theater so much. Is you used to be able to go into the movie theater and sit down in an auditorium with maybe 150, 200 people. And you could watch somebody you had seen embody another human being, become another individual in one movie that you really enjoyed, go onto that screen and embody a completely different person. And you get lost in it. We all do. Why is that? Because it's true. Not that acting is true, but that we become hypnotized by it because we recognize that that is what goes on each and every day in each of our lives, and oftentimes it's what we do. And so you'll see people. You see people do this all the time. They'll go and watch a movie, or they'll see a character on the screen, and they'll see one of their favorite actors embody it, and they'll get lost in the idea of that individual that they created, and they can get obsessed by it. And oftentimes get obsessed in creating themselves into an identical individual. Right? That many people describe when they meet their mentors or their heroes, a sense of disappointment. Because there's a process of building up the identity that happens externally too. Like I said, the ego process is two ways. It's external and internal. That individuals react to you based on what you present them, and so that your identity, like that, is extremely important for people to understand who you are. And maybe at a deeper level, this is why we have trust issues as well. I mean, think about it, guys. Who do we idolize? We idolize the people that have the ability to switch their mask the quickest and the most convincingly. That's who we idolize. This is seeped into our institutions as well. You can see people when you're at work, especially if you work for a big corporation. Watch how people act when they're around you, and then when they're in their role. See how much different those two people are. You don't have to think very hard why you don't trust them then. It's obvious. People give you examples every day of how they're disingenuous. It's like oftentimes, especially the modern individual, is so convinced that the only mode of being is this ego game, that they really are their ego, their conception of themselves, their mask, and that they can just switch it whenever they want. That the more people believe that, the more they don't have any conception of anything else. But I think there's something something connects here with the other deeper societal problems we're having. We've gone wrong fundamentally. And it's something like at recognizing what the human being is, what the human being's basic needs are. One of them being suffering. That the reason that we create mass is because we want to create something that's perfect. We all know how flawed we are, deep down. But we look out into the world and we go into our places of work and we see other people, and we look at social media, right? And we see other people presenting this perfect image. This life where everything's ironed out. They've got it all figured out. It's oftentimes an illusion, right? Nonetheless, this is what we see. And so then we question ourselves. Well, why the hell am I not that happy? Why the hell doesn't my mask impress anybody else as much as their mask does? Right? And so oftentimes people will try to look into the world and create themselves anew. They'll try to actually construct another mask and another mask and another mask, and they'll try that on and see how it works and how it fixes this issue, but then creates another one, right? It's like, and this is another very deep part here, I want to read this. Where did this character come from? And he's talking about Andy Kaufman. What is the dirt that the pearl is built around? And the pearl is the personality that you would build around yourself as a protection against that thought. If they ever found out that I am worthless, if they ever found out that I am not enough, I'll be destroyed. You gotta ask yourself, do you feel the same way? Because I do. Worthlessness. Suffering. Pain. Shame. Resentment. When you compare yourselves to other individuals, you're going to come up short every time. Because truth is an eternal thing. And then the truth is everybody is flawed. But that another truth is nobody wants to admit it. So that when you set up a value equation like, how do I compare to this individual or that individual, however you break it down, what you're doing is taking a data stream with a very small bandwidth, with a very small amount of data, right? You're looking at somebody else externally and trying to judge who they are, why they are where they are, all those kind of very deep questions, right? Purely based on your external perception of it. But when you compare that conception that you create to yourself, you're going to find that you can't be dishonest with yourself in that way. You can try, but that you'll deep down know you're lying. Oh, they have perfect hair. I know I don't have perfect hair. Whatever it is. right? Oh, they have this, I don't have this. Even if you say out loud or you speak or force the conversation in your head, like, no, I'm fine. The feeling, the sinking feeling, the inadequacy, it's within all of us. That fear of rejection, of actually being inadequate, makes each of us feel vindicated in hiding behind a mask that we create, one based off of the mask that other people have created. So much so that we feel justified in arguing for the only mode of being, for morality itself as being something like acting the best. Like I just said, there's a way in which you can't be dishonest with yourself. You can sense truth internally, but that you have to be willing to see it. Because when you see truth and it's surrounding a situation or an idea or whatever it is that is closely guarded, that is deeply held to you, what it'll inspire inside of you is something like pain, instability, confusion, unknown, fear. Well, look at all these other people. They all seem to have it together. But I have to try so hard to do this same thing that they do, and they seem to have no problem with it, right? Why does everybody else seem to have it so easy? You hear people saying that all the time, right? Everybody else seems to have it so easy. Stuff's just handed to them, and not me. I've got this big mountain to climb. Everybody's got a mountain to climb. The reason your mountain is bigger is because you're not recognizing you're on one. And those other people are having the same kind of struggles you're having. Maybe they're just better at hiding it, right? Maybe they're better actors. You're never worthless. No matter what happens in this world, no matter what you do in this world, you're never worthless. Because you are the thing that acts as the translator between those two worlds. So that even if you've acted your entire life disconnected from that deep role, that deep function in which you serve as a human being, you can always choose to turn it on. To fill that role. To be the translator. And I believe that's where the idea of, for a long time I struggled with the idea of predetermined, as life being predetermined. It's one of the fundamental questions I had to wrestle with myself when I was going through kind of my religious journey. Is all of this predetermined? It's a fundamental question. Does free will exist? And it's something like yes to both. Yes, this is predetermined. Yes, free will exists. Now, how can that be? Well, it's something like I think we view it wrong, the equation wrong. It relates to the idea of the butterfly effect in some way, that there's deeper ways in which the universe is connected that we haven't readily identified. So that the idea of time is something like an illusion. That time is a product of the way we perceive what we call the universe. So that we've developed a linear way in viewing the world. So that I don't believe that this journey that we're on, each of us, a spiritual journey, takes place in that same kind of timeline. Like, yes, it does, because we're all here, right? But whatever's guiding, whatever the laws underlying all of this are, I don't think it includes time. Because it's like there's this message that you see in most of the religions as well. It's something like you're never too far gone. You can always turn around, right? You can face the dragon. You can because whenever you make it, it's something like when you make the choice, it's like everything else aligns too. It's like I've been lost. Gone over some of the ways I've been lost. There's more ways I've been lost that we haven't yet. We will at some point, right? But we all get lost from time to time. And when we're lost, we look for what the next step is. And there's almost this way, if you really are in those positions where you're really stressed out and you don't know where else to look, that you almost will think of the world in a predetermined way. What comes next? Something comes next. It's very hard to not view it in a predetermined kind of condition. But what I think this is something like we have free will to align with the destiny that has been laid out for us. But that each decision you make, that destiny is changing as well. Does that make sense? And you probably say, well, that means that that it's not predetermined then. It's not definite. Well, it's like, you could say that, but that's assuming that there was a before and an after. You know what I mean? That time exists, that this is all linear. So that you always are where you're supposed to be. And you're never too far gone. It's so odd to me that the way you learn to love other people is to learn to love yourself. Why is that? It's because it's something like because the only way to embody the proper mode of being in which love comes into existence, proper love, true love, you have to be true. The truth is that you are whole. That yes, you are flawed, but you are whole. Right? You're not missing anything. There's nothing you need to go out into the world and find to make you whole again. You already have it. That you, not only are you not worthless, you are the thing through which the universe acts. You're the exact opposite of worthless. You're what determines worth. And that other people are too. So that in recognizing that you are the thing that creates reality, you open up the door, the pathway to love. True love. Not an ego-based game. It's not a logical-based thing, ever. That's a different way of viewing the world. We need more love. But the troubling part of it, the troubling aspect of it, is it truly does come from self-love. I was watching this Jordan Peterson talk. I've watched it over and over again, actually. I watch it quite often, but it was a talk on Genesis. Jordan Peterson does a whole series called the Biblical Series. He did it in 2017, and it goes through the book of Genesis. And he's going to be doing a new series here soon, I think, on the other books of the Bible. Psalms, I believe, is what he's starting with this next time. Anyway, during one of these lectures last night, he brought up this point that I'd heard before, but it kind of really dawned on me that in Genesis, in the creation story, you have this singular figure of God, the beginning of all things. And the part that we often miss is that, at least in the Christian stories, but it's rooted deeper than that. It's rooted in a lot of our ancient religious stories, ancient Mesopotamian stories, things that Jordan Peterson goes into in depth, and I'll try to post the video for you so you can research it yourself. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a second, guys. Give me 1 second. It's that the world and everything we see is created from God, from the singular thing that was at the beginning of all things, right? So that what that means is like the earth and the universe and the stars and everything was created from the matter that was God. You don't have to think of like a man standing there, but like whatever that was, that's what all this was created from. So what that means is something like you are made from the image of God. We see this in the Declaration, that all men are created equal under the image of God, right? In the image of God, endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights. That idea speaks of equity, the universal equality of existence itself, not the equity of outcome, but the equality of existence itself, because you are a piece of God. And you see this reinforced in the reason that the crucifix is such an important symbol in Christianity, and this is often missed, I think, as well, is that what Christians believe is that Jesus Christ was the embodiment of God on earth. Now, that's a hard idea to play with, because he's often referred to as the Son of God, right? But that in Catholicism, the Son of God is not a separate identity from God. That it's the embodiment, the human form of God on earth. And that there's a aspect of that required, that restraining, that there's a painful sense that God, in order to fit himself inside of the perspective of the human being, had to relinquish things. Something like the knowledge of being, right? So that when embodied, God was the same thing. Does that make sense? So in order for God to fit inside the human being, he had to like trim himself down. You know what I mean? It's too much to fit in one space. But that through that embodiment, the most revealing thing is that at the end of that story, with the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, before Jesus dies, the last thing he does is call out to God, asking him why has he forsaken him. Now that's such a deep idea, because you have to think about that for a second. God, the embodied form of God, is so tested by the suffering that occurs on earth that it actually causes him to question the existence of himself. That's a profound idea. What that talks about, what that says, is that there's a necessity for this being this way. You see that in the Eastern religions as well, for a balance of sorts. That suffering is not to be eliminated, it's to be embraced in some way. But that what you will see and the experience of embracing that suffering doesn't make it go away. Right? It will make you question. It is meant to test you in every possible way, to test your faith in something greater. And that it is a hell of a fucking test, people. One that is so difficult. The universe itself questioned itself. Questioned its motives. Are you actually malevolent? Can you imagine a God asking himself, are you actually doing this as a malevolent figure? I find something so invigorating about that idea. And I think the reason why is because it's something like, don't be too hard on yourself. Yes, The world and people in the world, modern day, I think, have degraded to a level that demands a certain amount of individual action. But that the reason that we've degraded is because this is a test, and it's a very difficult one. That the world and life itself is a test. It's the process through which the soul grows. The only way it does is to make it suffer. And that idea is so confounding that the thing that created it questions it. Should suffering exist? Right? What a fundamental question. But then you see why it's so important when it pops up in our political and social conversations. Why, when people talk about equality, when they talk about equality of outcome, right, that everybody needs to be equal, you have to read between the lines there in some ways. What would the motive be for doing that? Well, in some ways, probably to help people, right? Well, why do you want to help people? Because there's suffering going on. Well, is the suffering necessary? Or is there a necessity to eliminate it? That's where the conversation usually breaks down. The attempt to control that suffering and eliminate it is exactly what produces the worst forms of it. And we have many examples of that throughout human history. So that all we really need to do simply right now is not repeat the mistakes of our fathers. But hey, that's what human beings do too, right? I was listening to another Joe Rogan podcast about aliens. It was very interesting. It was 2 episodes ago, I think, if you're interested in looking at it. Jacques Vallée, I think is his name. He was one of the big guys in the UFO community, but they were talking about some stuff. I don't know how credible it is, right? But this apparently that there was this guy that was high up in the government that came out saying that we have been communicating with aliens, that we have their technology, that this has been going on for quite a while. And that what they were saying, the reasoning behind it is the reason why the aliens are here is in some ways to study us, but the reason they showed up is because we became a threat when we developed the atomic bomb, right? And so that there's this uneasiness that our galactic community or neighbors have with the human species, and that we are developing in some way. But that the fundamental reason that, if this is true, right, I'm talking about somewhat of a conspiracy here, but that if aliens were actually here doing this, that they're saying that they don't want to come play with us because we're too dangerous. You know what I mean? We're unevolved. That's the way you view that. A higher evolved being, form of life, wouldn't fight amongst itself because it's inefficient, right? But it requires a perspective shift. We have to be tied together by something that is unseen, that is not external. So I started with talking to yourself. But really what I'm talking about is internal dialogue. I think there's something to cultivating that conversation. That before I started this podcast, one of the things I started to do was just sit down each day or each night and record like this and talk to myself like this, but in like a radically honest way. To actually talk to myself. And as I started doing that, I realized, oh, this isn't something that's crazy. This is very practical, and it's very helpful. That when you speak something into being, it really is more easy to maintain it because it becomes something that's real. So it's like when you set out your goals verbally and you talk to yourself and you say, hey, this is what my goals are. Then when you wake up in the morning, that conversation is there. It's firm. It's real. So you can act on it. as Jordan Peterson talks about, when you're presented with the mush that is reality, the potential that is reality when you wake up and come back to reality from the dream world, it's incredibly complicated. There's so many different things you could do. But that if you cultivate a process of internal dialogue, it simplifies that you identify, create hierarchies of sorts, in which you can rank what needs to be done and what doesn't need to be done, what can be put off and what needs to take place right now. Both in a practical kind of physical sense, but also internally, like in a spiritual sense. What do you need to work on, right? And that is talking to yourself. And that one of the ways you could probably try to cultivate it is to do it out loud. If you feel like it's too scary to do it in public, which it probably is for most people, when you're at home and you're by yourself or whenever you feel comfortable, talk to yourself. Talk to yourself, right? I know that sounds a little goofy, but it works for me. And that's really what this podcast is, right? It's me trying to test some of these methods in my life, and if they work, and if they don't work, sharing them with you guys, because that's what we need. We can't continue to talk about these subjects, spiritual subjects, philosophical subjects, as if they're less important than the secular worldview or the logical way of approaching being. They aren't. They need to be involved in the conversation. You need to be involved in the conversation. And it's like a lot of the problems that people have internally right now of finding meaning, this deep problem of finding meaning and depression and weight and worthlessness that people feel. But that's, in a weird way, how you solve it. Talk to yourself, man. Talk to yourself like you're somebody you actually give a shit about. Like you're somebody that you'd want to actually see succeed. Like whatever you are deep down deserves to be recognized. That there's a travesty in denying who you are. That mask is sinful at a deep level. I don't mean you're going to hell, but I mean that's really what it is. It's like a contract with the devil. Selling your soul to the devil. That you don't need to do that. Ever. That the ways you think people are going to react to you and your true self are not the ways they actually will. I've found this out over the last 6 months, 7 months, that as I've opened up, as I've explored myself and been more honest with myself, the ways I expected people to react to that and the ways they actually reacted are 180 degrees opposite. My sexuality, the military things, right? My experiences with Amazon and all of the hardship with my love life, right? Like, I didn't expect my parents to be accepting. I was scared of them turning away from me, right? I thought that people would view me in a negative light when I talked about my military experience. Instead, I got people reaching out, saying how much they appreciated that I shared it, right? Amazon was an extremely difficult time for me, one in which I came out demoralized. But that I've gotten further away from that, I've had many people reaching out to me, expressing how much they appreciated my effort and the work I did while I was there. Don't hide from yourself. Don't tell yourself you're worthless because of the cards you've been dealt or the way in which the world is developing. Use it as fuel. If the world makes you feel depressed, stop looking at the world. There's like an internal thing inside of you that is just begging you to talk to it, like an old friend, right? You can. Just got to say hi. And with that is the Unfounded podcast signing off. I want to thank you very much for tuning in today, guys. Have a really good week. Lots of love. Talk to you soon.